Good morning, Harvest. The scripture reading for today comes from two places. The very first is from Mark 5:18 through 20. Hear the word of the Lord. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And everyone marveled. The second comes from John 4:39 through 42. Many Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me all that I ever did. So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. And many more believed because of his word. They said to the woman, "It's no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves. We know that this is indeed the Savior of the world." Thanks be to God. Well, this morning I want to continue in this series through the Gospel of Mark, because that's actually where we were nearly 8 months ago when all of this craziness began and the church had to shut down. And now as we're slowly beginning to return in person, I just felt that it'd be fitting if this is where we would return. So this morning I want to continue with this message that I'm calling My Story. Did you know that every single one of you have your own stories that God can use to glorify his name? Let me set it up this way. I remember when I was in seminary, I had a professor who believed that churches tend to run in two ways. The first is he believed that sometimes churches were a lot like museums, and so you see this picture up right here. And you can see the attention to detail on this sculpture is mesmerizing, how this sculpture had captured things down to very facial expressions and moods and emotions. And when I think about it, just some of our counterparts throughout history have been capable of things that are nothing short of genius. And that's what museums tend to do. They tend to showcase the very best of human creation. Our greatest feats of artistry, our very greatest examples of genius and talent. But yet, despite how beautiful museums are, there's oftentimes one thing that's missing. Most of what we're looking at is not alive. And it seems that sometimes churches can be just like museums, where everyone shows up and they're dressed in their Sunday finest and everyone looks beautiful on the outside and no one seems to have a care in the world. But despite how perfect everything looks inside those buildings, sometimes the reality is there's very little true life. Nobody really cares whether you actually know God. And when we reach the end of our time here in this world, all of us will see that the only lives that really mattered for anything were the ones that walked with God. But no one seems to really care whether you actually do that. Well, my professor believed that there was a second way that churches could run, maybe the opposite of a museum. He believed that a church could be like a hospital. And so I put up a picture right here of a hospital, and it seems like there's this emergency. There's this person lying in a hospital bed. They're kind of rushing this person to a very important location. And hospitals, they tend to be places where there's a great sense of urgency. There's a great deal of worry and fear. Because people go to hospitals because something's gone wrong. Someone has dislocated their shoulder in a bicycle accident. I have blood in my lungs. Something is going wrong. But yet, despite how much fear and anxiety is found inside a hospital, hospitals, wouldn't you agree, they tend to be places of great hope. Because no matter how badly someone's doing, they go to hospitals because they hope things can get better. And I like to believe that our church is a lot more like a hospital than it is a museum. Because I think I could bring anyone who's ever been a part of my life to this church, and you would love them well. And I like to believe that anyone who comes through our doors would find God in this place. Well, this morning I want to share with you the stories of two people who have led rather shameful lives. The first is this woman from John chapter 4. Here is this woman who has made so many mistakes, who's had so many questionable relationships with men, to be quite frank, who's led such a checkered past that it seems that her own people have given up on her. And the second is this man from Mark chapter 5, this man who at one point had been possessed by thousands of demons. And I find it so perplexing that God chose these two people to be the ones that he wanted to tell the world about him. Because when we're still in school and we're picking sides for sports, we tend to pick the best athletes first. And on Tuesday, when we select the next president of the United States, we're going to pick what we believe is the best candidate, someone that can help our country move to a better place. But yet, why does God choose these two people? One is this woman who had committed adultery not just once, but over and over again throughout her life. The second is this man who at one point had thousands of demons living inside his head. And God picked these two people to tell others about him. And as I look into their stories, I see three lessons that we can learn from their stories about how God can use your stories, regardless of where you've been or what's happened or what you might even be struggling with today. How God can use your stories to bring glory to his name. Well, so let's get to it. The very first lesson that I learned from their stories is that all you need is a real encounter to minister. What I mean by minister is that you could help someone in your life truly find God in a saving way. That you could help someone to change the way that they really need to change for God. And all that you need to minister to someone else is a real encounter with God. And so perhaps that's my starting point for this morning's message. What about you? Have you had a real encounter with God recently? I think it's so interesting the way that God meets both of these people that you're about to meet, because he meets them in seemingly the most embarrassing moment in their lives, when their lives have hit rock bottom, when they seem to have nothing to show for all of their lives. The first is this woman in John chapter 4, this woman at the well. And it seems in verses 1 through 7 that Jesus finds himself in this small town of Samaria, but it's in the dead heat of the summer, and so he's hot and he's weary, and so he sits down next to this well to get relief when he runs into this woman at the well. And it seems that this woman has faced one challenge after another throughout the entirety of her life. To begin with, it seems that her first challenge is she's a woman. And that sounds kind of strange. Why would being a woman be a challenge? Well, you have to understand that in a male-dominated culture that women were not allowed to work. They're not allowed to go to school. And you can imagine just what a challenge that would be for a single woman. But yet, that's who she was. She was a single woman. But the second challenge, it's not even professional, it's more personal. You see, as this woman begins to open up to our Lord, she shares that she had at one time been married 5 separate times in her life. But yet, all 5 of her marriages had ended in failure. And I just want you to put yourself in her shoes. What would it do to you if you had 5 marriages in your life and none of those 5 marriages worked out? What would it do to you? Would you really be able to trust anyone anymore after going through all that? Would you still believe that love was possible for you, real love, somewhere in this world, and you just had to find it? What would it do to you to be divorced 5 separate times? Well, the third challenge seemed to be that just who this woman was. You see, this woman was a Samaritan, and all that means is that she was this half-breed. She was half Jewish and half Assyrian, and what that meant was that she was rejected on every side by both of her ancestors. You see, these Jews wanted nothing to do with her because whenever they would look at Samaritans, they'd be reminded of one of the most painful periods in their people's history, when the Assyrians had enslaved the Jews and had brutalized many of them. And so these Jews wanted nothing to do with these Samaritans. But the problem was neither did the Assyrians because they were half Jewish. And so what they did was they pushed these Samaritans into this isolated region called Samaria because neither of their ancestors wanted anything to do with them. And at least for the Jews, when they would have to travel through Samaria to get to some point on the other side, rather than taking the logical short way and just going through Samaria, such was their disdain for these people that they would take the long way and they would walk extra around Samaria because they just didn't want to take the chance that they'd even have to look at these people. And so for these Samaritans, they were rejected by all of their ancestors. But specifically for this woman, the challenge seemed to be much more personal. You see, if it wasn't bad enough that she was rejected by her ancestors, it seemed that she was rejected by her own people, the people who were in the same shoes as herself. You see, John tells us that all of this took place at the 6th hour, which customarily during the dead heat of summer was considered the worst hour. It was around noon when the sun would hang high in the sky and it would shine so intensely upon people that whenever they would go outside, it would be like instantly that their shirts would just be drenched in sweat, that the intensity of the heat would just sap away all of their strength. And so customarily, no one would even attempt to go out in the dead of the heat. What they'd do is they'd wait for sunset when the sun would go down and they could at least get some relief. And then they'd store up as much water as possible so they wouldn't be stuck in the sun the following day. And so why is this woman out in the very worst possible time of the day? Well, her reputation had preceded her. And by now, so many people had known all the things that she had done that whenever she would go out, people would see her with these hateful glares. They would just mutter these nasty things under their breath as she would pass by, and she just knew that they were whispering and talking and speculating about her behind her back. And after a while, she just didn't want to deal with it anymore. She would rather suffer the worst hour of the day, the intensity of the sun, than to deal with all that. And yet it's in this worst possible hour of the day that she meets God, because she meets Jesus by the well and he starts to tell her who he really is. He explains that he has this living water, that if she would just drink of it, that she would never thirst again. And praise God, she actually begins to believe. And so she returns to this town, these people that she was ashamed to even show her face to before. And she starts to tell them about God. Well, the second story is from Mark 5. It's about this man who, in many ways, makes this woman look like a real superstar. You see, this man is just trouble. He's just bad news, because this man is possessed by these demons that call themselves the Legion. And what that means is some people believe that he had 6,000 demons living inside of him, because a legion in the army would contain up to 6,000 soldiers. Now, we don't know if that's true, because demons oftentimes lie. But the idea is there were a lot. Because after Jesus casts these demons out into these herds of pigs, and they rush over the side of the cliff and they drown to their death, and John tells us that there were several thousand pigs in that herd. And again, we don't know if this was a 1-to-1 ratio. The idea is that there were thousands upon thousands of demons living inside his head. I don't know if you've ever seen those witchcraft movies. What happens usually is some demon possesses a human host, and eventually the human is just driven out of their minds. Because demons like to play games mentally with their hosts. They like to play up their worst insecurities. They like to whisper these angry thoughts into their minds. They like to accentuate and remind them of their deepest fears. And as they play these mental games with their hosts, these people often are driven into insanity. And so it is with this man. It seems that he doesn't have just one demon living inside of him, but he has several thousand. And these demons are constantly playing games with this man. They're causing him to pick up rocks and injure himself over and over again. And so they tie this man down just to protect him from himself and from other people. But it seems that in the evenings, he is filled with this demonic strength, and he just pops these shackles off of his wrists. And what you oftentimes see this man doing at night is he's just lurking in these cemeteries, just screaming and howling in misery and in agony. And so Jesus meets this man who's possessed by thousands and thousands of demons, and he sets him free. He just casts all the demons out of him. And when this man returns to his rightful man, just like the woman, he goes back to this home, to these people who were creeped out by him and frightened by him. And he too starts to tell them about the Lord. There's something that we can learn from these two colorful individuals. And it's this: all that we need to minister to someone, all that we need to help that person truly find God in a saving way, all that we need to help that person to finally change the way that they need to for God, is a real encounter with God. Because as I look at these people, what do they really have to show for their lives? Like what can they point to that they can stand on when all else fails? What do they have to show for all the years that they've lived on this earth? And it would seem like they have nothing. They have nothing at all. The only good thing that's ever happened to them, seemingly in their entire lives, was that they met God. But therein is such insight. If the one positive thing that they've done in their lives is that they met God, then what that tells me is the only thing that any of us need to minister to someone else is a genuine encounter with God. As I look into the scriptures, I see many imperfect people. Isaiah said that he was a man of unclean lips. Did you know the Apostle Paul believed that he was the worst of all sinners because of his past? Jesus promises in the Beatitudes that blessed are those whose strength is in the Lord. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And I don't know if you realize this, but there's going to be a lot of people in heaven, because there's going to be people from every century throughout all of time in the kingdom of heaven. But yet, despite all the different people in heaven, we will all share one quality: that in our lives on earth, we all saw that we did need God. And it was from that place that everything began to change. I wonder if for many of us who are gathered here this morning, we too have these places of need in our lives today. And maybe that place is somewhere in your profession, or maybe it's something personal, maybe it's your health, maybe it's something relational. But I want to tell you something this morning, that there is hope even in that place. Because if you give that place to God, if you choose to find God in your place of need, well, that's the place where everything can begin to change. There's a second lesson that I see from their stories. It's just that your weakness uniquely qualifies you. Because I asked myself, what would my reaction be if I were in their shoes? And I wonder if for most of us, despite how undeniable God had worked in our lives, would it be hard for us to return to our homes and tell them about God? And I think the thinking is do they really want to hear that from us? They know us. They know what we're really like. Maybe at least for the woman, some of them knew some of these men that she used to be married with. And are they really wanting to hear about God from us? But yet what the gospel tells us is that it's actually even our weaknesses that uniquely qualify us for God's work. Reminds me of 1 Corinthians 1, where Paul was speaking to this superstar church that was filled with these people, many of whom they believed that they were actually superstars. And so God reminds them of their beginnings. For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. Well, what were they? But God chose what is foolish to shame the wise. God chose what is weak to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. And God chose the foolish, and he chose the weak, so that no one would boast in the presence of God. Because what he's saying is that we need to be careful when we grow successful in life. We need to be really cautious when we begin to become more and more accomplished in life. Because the reality of it all is there is a way to go about our accomplishments that actually robs God of his glory in a way that no human is entitled to. 2 Corinthians 4:7, but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. And I put this picture up of these jars of clay because did you realize that many people believe that these jars were actually portable toilets? And I know that this is a bit crude, but what it means is that people would actually defecate inside these jars of clay. But yet Paul says that there's treasure in these jars of clay. And what it means is that sometimes the most valuable things that God will give to us, including our very salvation, will be in the lowest moments of our lives. And as I put these two verses together, one undeniable truth that I see is that even though God can use anyone in this world, he can use the successful, he can use the beautiful, he can use the rich and the wealthy and the educated. What I see undeniably through these two verses is that for whatever reason, God especially loves to use those of us who are weak. That God loves to use those of us who find ourselves in lowly positions today. And so I explain it kind of like this. I recall when we were first getting ready to bring Josh back from Korea, we were finally at that point where we were allowed to adopt Joshua formally and bring him back home. I remember that because I had never been a parent before, I never did anything like this before. I was struggling with this insecurity that I was going to completely ruin Josh's life. Would I make a mistake? Would he see me fall down in a way that would stumble him, that he would start to imitate him and it would just completely wreck his life? And so I was struggling with this insecurity as a first-time father. And so I remember meeting with this older brother in the faith of mine who I greatly respected. He also was a father and he had children that were much older than I. And I was just sharing with him, I've never done this before. And what if I mess up Josh's life? What if I fall down and he sees me making all these mistakes? I mean, I know what a mess up I really am. Am I going to completely ruin this young man's life? And I remember what he shared with me. It was so true. He said, Gerald, I know you don't want to make any mistakes, but the reality is it's going to happen. You will fall down. But what Josh needs to see from you is what you do when you're lying on the ground. Will your son see a father who always gets back up and goes to God? And I thought that there was such truth to that because everyone falls down in life. Everyone makes mistakes. Whether or not anyone sees it, the reality is we're all human. We all make mistakes. But what do you do when you've fallen down? Because what the world needs to see, because they cannot find it in themselves, is that we can get back up because God gives us hope. Psalm 84, 5 and 6. Blessed are those whose strength is in you, in whose hearts are the highways to Zion. And as they go through the valley of Baca, They make it a place of springs. The early rain also covers it with pools. Of course, this valley of Baca was translated literally the valley of tears, because it seemed that in some of the lowest moments in Israel's history, that they were forced to walk through this valley of Baca, but they would go through it with much weeping. But it seemed that for some of these people of God, their hope was in the Lord. And so they were able to transform this experience in the valley of tears into a time of great joy, with tears instead replaced by pools and springs of hope and optimism, because their hope was in the Lord. And what a perfect picture of the gospel that can transform our tragedies into triumphs. And really, our weaknesses uniquely qualify us, that when we find ourselves with our backs on the floor and against the wall, when we get back up and return to God, what we show the world is that we have a real God for a real world who can give us a real hope, no matter where any of us find ourselves in life today. No, your weakness, even the things that you might be struggling with today, are the very things that uniquely qualify you, that become the very stuff of ministry to other people, if you can choose to find God in this place. Well, there's one third and final lesson that I learned from these people's stories. It's just that your story is a powerful weapon. Did you know that God can use your story in the most powerful of ways? Because I asked myself again, what was so powerful about either of these people? They have no money because they have no jobs. They're not educated. They have nothing but shame in their lives. But yet how God uses their stories in really remarkable ways. Look at the aftermath of this woman's life, John 4:39. It says, many Samaritans, meaning obviously not just a few people, but many Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me all that I ever did. And what would allow these Samaritans who had given up on this woman, some of whom knew the men that she used to be married to, what would allow them to completely change their lives for God because of this woman? And it was her story. She just shared about what God had done in her life, that truly, I am a life that was changed. And same with this man who once had thousands and thousands of demons living inside his head. Look at the aftermath of his story in Mark 5:20. It says, he went away and he began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And what does it say? Again, not just a few people, but everyone marveled. And this Decapolis, of course, is this region of 10 cities. And it seemed that this man began to go through the streets of each of these 10 cities, telling all these people about the Lord. And I find that really remarkable, because the tone is that when he first begins to believe and Jesus finally sets him free, that there were at least a few people who were annoyed by Jesus, because those pigs were theirs. And after the pigs rush to their own death and they drown in the sea, they're kind of frustrated. Why did you do this? And the implication of it all is maybe they actually preferred that this demon remained enslaved to just thousands and thousands of demons than take away my pigs. But yet in Mark chapter 7, just 2 chapters later, when Jesus returns to the Decapolis, what he finds, instead of some people that are annoyed that he took away their pigs, is it says that he finds crowds of people waiting for him who now all believe because of this man's story. And I think to myself of the thousands and thousands of people who give their lives to the Lord because of these 2 people with such colorful stories, how they share with their families and they share with their kids, and their kids begin to believe and they share with their own kids. And so you see generation upon generation of people, all who believe, the thousands of people whose lives were changed, all because of these 2 colorful people who are willing to share their story, that truly ours were lives that have been changed. Revelation 12:11, I thought this was insightful. And they, being believers, those who are found in the kingdom of heaven, have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. For they loved their lives, not their lives, even unto death. And it seemed that what helped so many people to find life was not only the word, but these people's stories of what God had done in their lives. I recall before this whole lockdown went into effect that Angie, Josh, and I had gone to Costco and we were doing some shopping, and Josh and I were just kind of, wandering around the store and waiting for Angie to finish. And we found ourselves in front of this blender display, and these were like really expensive blenders. I recall that they were about $400 a piece. And it's not like I was particularly interested in the blender or even that I was even paying attention. I was just trying to pass my time watching them cut up this fruit and throw it into the blender. When I recall that there was this man standing next to me, and he was like almost ranting and raving about how great this blender was. And he was talking about how this was the piece, the missing piece, the final piece that he was waiting for. He was trying to get back in shape, and how this blender could produce all these smoothies, these fruit smoothies that he would drink every day instead of eating bad food, and how this was the missing piece. This was all that he was waiting for to get back in shape. And the next thing I knew, I had my hand in there. I said, I'll take one, right? I'll take the red one. And thank goodness, Angie shows up and she says, no, he's just kidding. And he grabs my wrist and she forces it back down, or else I would have made this foolish purchase. But do you realize how powerful stories are? And how many of us have been personally impacted because we saw true faith in someone else's life? Did you know that every one of you have your own stories in your own life, even stories that are being written today, that God can use in the most powerful of ways? I wonder, what's your story of what God has done in your life? And would you share your story to the glory of his name? Well, why don't we just take a moment to bow our heads and pray as we close for today. I just wanted to give you just a few seconds before we close in some worship for today to pray into the Lord and to respond to him. And won't you just pray for one thing? Who is that person who's in your heart that you love, but you worry for them because they do not know the Lord? And won't you pray for that person that they would find the Lord? And number 2, here is a second prayer request. What's your story of what God has done in your life? Won't you pray that God would give you opportunities to share your story? That God would use your story in remarkable ways to help people to find God in a saving way, to help someone to change in the way that they really need to change for God. That God would use your story to glorify his name. Would you just take a few moments to consider these things and to pray?